This is the Tamron 20-40mm lens f2.8, and in this video I want to go through my experience working with this lens and why this is my go-to lens for all of the content that I'm creating. But I also want to dig into some of my biggest frustrations with this lens to give you a clear understanding of what you get with the Tamron 20-40 and if this is a good lens for you. Now, just a disclaimer up front, Tamron is not a part of this video at all. I purchased this lens back in October, and this is just my honest review after working with this lens. So this lens basically just lives on my camera now. It's 20-40mm, which is wider than you typically find on this style of lens. Usually you'll find somewhere in the range of 24-70 or 16-35, which for years are the two standard lenses that you typically get if you want zoom lenses. And then the 70-200, and that's the trifecta that covers basically the whole range that you could potentially need when you're out filming. Now, the issue that I've found is that working on a 24-70, the 24 is not quite wide enough. I personally like a little bit wider, but I don't need a 16. And beyond doing vlog style content, when you're shooting anything else, the 16-35 needs a little bit more reach. And typically they're big, heavy lenses. If you get a 16-35 2.8, it's a big, heavy lens. So where this lens sits is a wide lens, but it does have a little bit more reach with that 40mm. Now, I bought this lens immediately when it was released back in October. I used it for a few videos here on my channel, and then I took it out to India and shot a documentary. Overall, this is just a good all-around lens to cover a wide range of focal lengths. 20 is perfect for doing vlog style content, talking head content, anything where you just want a wide shot, but being able to zoom into 40mm gives you a range to give you a much more punched in field of view and something that does have some more cinematic qualities. Now, even though it's a 20-40, it's actually more realistically like a 20-60 depending on the camera that you're using. So on my A7S III, you could use clear image zoom, which gives you that 1.5 crop. Also, if you have a camera that has an APS-C crop, well, you can zoom in, so it gives you more range. And so when I've been using this with my A7S III, effectively, I have more of a 20-60, which the clear image zoom I think works fine depending on the situation that you're shooting in. It's obviously not going to be perfect for everyone in every situation, but shooting video content in the run and gun style that I do, I think it works. Now let's talk about the lens quality and what features you have on this lens. Now, this lens is a consistent 2.8 across all the range. So when you're zooming, you're not going to be dealing with your aperture fluctuating. When you have the lens at 40mm, that's the smallest the lens gets. However, when you zoom out to 20mm, the lens does extend slightly. And this will come into play a little bit later. But it's not a huge extension, so this lens still has a fairly small size. If you compare it to the Sony 20mm, they're roughly the same size. So this definitely sits in that range of being a lightweight lens that is small and compact. The other one that's comparable is the Sony 16-35 f4. It's about the same size and roughly the same weight, but the issue with the 16-35 is it's a consistent f4 versus a 2.8. So you're gonna get an extra stop of light with the Tamron lens, which also is gonna give you a little bit more shallow depth of field if you do want that look when you're out filming. Personally, I've always shot my vlog style content using the 20mm 1.8. However, you're limited with the 20 1.8 because it's one focal length, it's a prime. So I was always having to switch lenses if I didn't want such a wide field of view. All right, let's do a quick vlog test using this lens. I'm at 20mm, arm extended away. I'm just hand holding the camera. And while we're doing a quick little vlog test, I want to tell you about the Creator Film School. So I have a website dedicated to teaching you everything that you need to know to be a solo creator. So I'll include a link down below in the description to where you can check out the Creator Film School. All right, let's get back to the review of the Tamron 20-40. So the 20-40 Tamron fills that gap where I could use it for just kind of everyday content, talking head stuff, but then also be able to zoom in and get some different styles of B-roll shots. Now let's talk about the sun flares, because that is something that you want to know if you're gonna have weird flaring happening with the lens. So you can see from this shot right here, just shooting with the sun, stop down to an f22, you can see how the flare kind of hits across the lens. It's got a good shape to it and it's not too distracting. I personally don't mind the look of this flare. And when I'm shooting my projects, I like to get flares in there. Now also with a lens, you want to think about the sunburst. And so you could see from the sun, when it's stopped down to an f22, gets a nice star pattern, and I think it looks good. Nothing too out of the ordinary,
that makes me say that this lens is bad in any way when it comes to the flare or the starburst.
Now, when you zoom with the lens, it's not as smooth as you would find on a Sony lens. And overall, the build quality is good, but it does feel just a little bit cheaper than these different Sony lenses that I have sitting over here.
But also with the build quality, this lens is weather sealed. So you can use this in a variety of situations and you don't have to worry about dust or moisture getting into the lens. When I was in India, it was super dusty where I was at. It was dirty, it was kind of muddy, and I had no issues working with this lens and no problems with the weather sealing from my experience working with it.
Now, on the lens itself, there's no way to switch between autofocus and manual focus. So everything has to be done internally in the camera. So when I'm working in this lens, I have a button set on the back of my camera to be able to switch between autofocus and manual focus. It's one thing that's limiting about this lens is there's no physical controls on the lens itself. You only have focus and zoom capabilities on the lens. On these different Sony lenses that we've been talking about, you have a bunch of different things like focus, zoom, the ability to switch between autofocus and manual focus. You have a button that you can customize, and then you also have an aperture ring. And that's one thing that I really like about Sony's glass is that they're including aperture rings, especially geared towards video creators, because you could switch this between clicked or declicked, which when it's declicked, you can do smooth movements with your aperture and be able to change it as you're recording, and you won't see this step down happen. On the Tamron lens, you don't have that ability. There's nothing on this lens. There's no aperture control. So again, you have to do that through the camera, and you're gonna have to use one of your wheels, and it's gonna be that stepped motion. So whenever you're switching your aperture, you're gonna see a clear transition between one aperture to the other. For me, the biggest frustration with this lens is the fact that there is no physical controls on the lens itself. Now, the only other thing that you're gonna find on the lens is a USB-C port, which is where you can update the lens. So there could be updates in the future to improve different characteristics of the lens. Now, in terms of focus capability, I haven't noticed any major issues with this lens focusing. It's snappy, it's quick, and you can see here, I have two examples side by side. This is my 20mm 1.8, shooting at 2.8, and this is the Tamron at 20. And here's just walking forward, and you can see how the focus responds to me in this environment between both of these lenses. On the front, you have a 67mm filter thread, so it keeps it small and compact. However, if you want to use something like a variable ND filter, you're definitely going to want to use a bigger ND filter, because I noticed that there's vignetting with filters at the 20 range. So when I'm shooting anything at 20 and I have a 67mm variable ND on here, you'll definitely see some vignetting. So what I've been doing more recently is I have a bigger 72 or 82mm variable ND filter that I use with this lens, and that way I'm not getting any vignetting. Now, the other frustration is the fact that this lens does zoom slightly when you go from 20 to 40. And so that becomes a problem when you're working with gimbals, because when you zoom between 20 and 40, it's gonna change the balance of the gimbal. So one thing that you're gonna have to do is rebalance your gimbal when you switch your focal lengths. It isn't the biggest deal in the world, but after working with the 16 to 35 from Sony, this doesn't change your balance at all going from 16 to 35. This lens is completely balanced through all focal lengths. And the reason they did that is because this is made to go on gimbals. It's made to go on their AirPeak drone. This is definitely built for video and cinema, and that's why they kept it so small and they keep it balanced. Before I was using the Tamron 20-40, this was my go-to lens. However, it's an f4, and I would rather have the little bit of range towards the 40 versus the 35.
Now, another thing that's frustrating about this lens is the focus ring. When you're doing manual focus, especially when you're doing like focus pulls, it's not set up for video shooters because it's the smallest movement to go from close focus to far focus. So I've gotten used to the throw, and it's just like a little movement to go between close to far, but it is something that's a little bit frustrating. I would love to see more focus throw on that ring so that I could do smoother rack focuses when I'm in manual focus.
Now, in terms of image quality, I haven't noticed any major loss in image quality with this lens versus my Sony glass, and everything looks sharp. Now, one of the biggest factors of this lens is the price. It's $699, so it's a super cheap lens when you look at it compared to all the other lenses within this focal range and capabilities. There's not a lot of options that are an f2.8 in this focal range that are this cheap.
One other thing about this lens, it's not parfocal. So when you zoom in and out, you'll see the focus shift slightly. It's kind of unfortunate. But for the price, wasn't expecting parfocal anyways. Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the new lens that was announced by Sony, which is a 20 to 70 millimeter. However, that lens is an f4. But when you look at these two side by side, it solves the problem of having wider than a 24-70 lens, but also giving you that range of a 70. So 20-70 is a focal length that you don't normally see. And when you look at that lens, I mean, I don't have one in person, but when you look at that lens, almost every characteristic about it is better than this lens, and it has a better focal range. The only thing that's really the big difference is it's an f4 versus an f2.8, which could make a little bit of a difference if you want more blurriness in the background. Also, if you're shooting in low light settings, having that extra stop of light is nice. Now, the other thing with the Sony lens is that it's $1,100, whereas this one is $700. So, price difference. I mean, you get a lot more for that price. Definitely a lens that I'm gonna check out as soon as they're available and see if that lens will replace this lens. Because for now, this is my go-to lens for YouTube style content. So is this a good lens to get? Well, that really comes down to your use case. For me, I've enjoyed using this lens and it's worked well for the types of videos that I make. However, this lens is not perfect. And as I've mentioned, there's a lot of little flaws with this lens and things that are just kind of frustrating to work with. However, depending on the types of videos that you're making, this may be a good lens for you to get. Now next, you should check out this video right here, which is my documentary from India. And I shot a huge majority of this project using this 20-40mm lens. So if you want to see how this lens performs in a run and gun documentary style shoot, well, check out that video. I'll see you over there.